Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to Tim's Awesome Projects. In this episode, I want to talk to you about the different types of electrical systems used in conversion vans. While this can also apply to basically any RV, but we're focusing on vans themselves. So when it comes to electrical systems, most people think of 12 volt, which is the most common and widely used. So I want to suggest to you some alternate voltage systems that are better suited in many applications. I'm going to give you some examples of alternate systems that I use in my builds, and I'm going to explain the advantages of using them. And near the end of the video, I'm going to talk about air conditioning and the pros and cons of different systems and the unique system that I use. So going back to voltage systems, the three largest considerations when designing an electrical system in a van are weight, space, and value. And I consider value to be a function of cost over time. Using a higher voltage decreases the current for the same amount of power. This allows us to use a smaller wire gauge, which reduces the weight and cost of our system. In theory, using the highest voltage possible for our batteries would be best. But the choice and availability of accessories such as chargers and inverters drastically decreases. So I found using 24 volts to be the sweet spot, with 48 volts being a close second. Since not everything is practical to run at 24 volts, you will still need 12 volts and or 120 volts for these items. For low power items like lights, USB chargers, vent fans, and etc., I will use a 24 volt to 12 volt DC converter. Typically a 40 amp converter is sufficient for most needs. However, I opt for a 24 volt to 13.8 volt converter instead of using 12 volts. This helps overcome losses in long wiring runs. When needed, I will also use 12 volts for actuators and macerator pumps. Alright, I can already hear some of you asking, if we're going to convert it to 12 volts, why use 24 volts anyways? And if we're just dealing with light loads, then yeah, there's no sense in using 24 volts, might as well just stick with 12 volts. But with heavier loads, that's a little different story. Let me explain to you using this spreadsheet and wiring chart. So here we have a spreadsheet that's used for calculating loads and current, and it also will tell you for particular wire gauges how many ohms for that certain length, how much it'll weigh, how much voltage drop we'll have on that, loss in watts. It'll also tell us efficiency and the cost of the wiring, although honestly that can vary quite a bit. Over on the other side, I have a chart that you can find at bluesea.com/resources/1437. So this follows the ABYC, which is the American Boating and Yacht Council, their recommendations for wire sizing. And I find this is a really good chart to use even in for RV vehicles. And they give you two different sections. So the one they call it non-critical is only will give you a 10% voltage drop up to that. Where if you got a critical where you want no more than 3% voltage drop, then you would want to follow this column here for length. And I'll go into this in just a minute. So for our example, let's say we want to look at a somewhat light load. We're going to put in here 100 watts. And let's say this is going to be 20 feet length of cable, but because electrically it's a loop, so it goes through the positive to it and then back on the negative, we're going to double that. So we're going to say we got a 40-foot loop. So now in this section up here, I have where for 12 volts it'll show us. And at 12 volts, that means it's going to pull 8.33 amps. So let's say this is a non-critical load, so we can use this column here. So we're at 40 feet, so we'll want to go to the next highest, which is 50 feet. And then we want to go follow this over till we're showing amperage that our amperage would fall in. So with 8.3 amps, we're going to need to go up to the 10 amps. So they're recommending a 12 gauge wire.
So 12 gauge wire, for that, the cabling will weigh approximately 1.6 pounds. We'll have a half a volt drop, which gives us a loss of 4.4 watts. And that makes our efficiency at 95.59%. And the cost of that cabling is $13.60. So now if we're using 24 volts at 4.17 amps, so we're going to go back to the 50 foot. So now at 5 amp, we're under 5 amps on the 24 volt load. So now we only need a 16 gauge cable for that. So on this one, we're going to have a loss of 2.8 watts, and we're going to be at 97.21% efficiency. So a little bit better efficiency, and the cost of our wiring is a little bit less than using the 12 gauge. It's not that much. And in this case, if that was the only thing that we're using on our battery system, then I would say going to 24 volts probably isn't worth messing with. Okay, but now let's show another example. Let's go to 500 watts. And we'll use that same 40 foot length. So now to do a 500 watt load, we're going to be at 41 amps. So let's say this is still non-critical. So we're going to follow this 50 foot column over. Or I should say row, 50 foot row. So we're going to have to go all the way over to the 50 amp to have enough wire capacity. So now we need to go to a 6 gauge wire. So with a 6 gauge wire at 41 amps, for that 40 foot length, or actually 40 foot loop, so 20 foot length, we're going to have 5 pounds of cabling, a drop of 0.6 volts, which is a loss of 27.4 watts. And that gives us an efficiency of 94.51%. And the cost of that cabling is going to be $46.80 approximately. Okay, so now if we go to a 24 volt a 24 volt system, our amperage, of course, is cut in half, so we're at 20.8. So if we follow this chart at the 50 foot length and we go over to, we're a little over 20, so we better go up to the 25 amp. Let's see, so that's an 8 gauge wire. So if we go to the 8 gauge wire, now we're at 3.6 pounds for that wire instead of 5 pounds. We're at half a volt drop. So our loss is 10.9 watts, whereas before we had a loss of 27 watts. Our efficiency is at 97.8%, and the cost of our cabling is $30. So we saved $16. And now we're getting to the point where it's pretty close. I'd say you'd probably see some benefit by going to the 24 volt system. Now let's say we want to do a 1,000 watt load. And same way, we're going to be 40 feet away. So now we're looking at 83 amps. So when we look at 83 amps, go to the row for 50 feet. And we're going to go all the way over to, better go up to 90 amps. So now we need a 2 gauge wire. So with a 2 gauge wire, our weight now is 10.8 pounds. And we have a loss of 43 watts with efficiency of 95.66%. Look at the cost of our cabling, $185.20. Okay, now if we're doing that at 24 volts, let's see. So now we're at 41 amps. So now if we do the 50 feet length row, and we're going to go over till we're just above, so we're have to use the 50. So now we're at the 6 gauge wire. So we have a loss of 27.4 watts compared to the 43.4 before. Higher efficiency, 97.26%, and a cost of $46. So you can see 12 volt system, we were looking at $185.20 for cabling. Now we're only $46.80. All right, so now let's look at an example of wiring in an inverter to our battery system. And let's say we want to do a calculation for doing 2000 watt load, say a 2000 watt inverter. And we're going to keep our inverter fairly close to our batteries. But let's say our combined cabling distance is say 5 feet, which for negative and positive will give us 10 feet. So now when we look at 12 volts, we're going to be pulling over 160 amps. So when we go to our wire chart, so at 0 to 20 feet, we're going to be in this column. And if we come over to 200 amps, it's recommended that we use a 2-aught wire. Because it's such a short drop, I think we could probably get away with 1 gauge wire, which is actually the lowest my chart goes down to. So at that, we're going to have a loss of 34 watts if we're pulling a full 2000 watts with a 98% efficiency. And the cost of our cabling is $62.50. Okay, but now if we go to 24 volts at a 83.3 amps, now if we follow that over, we can get away with a 4 gauge wire, which a little bit lower weight, obviously, about the same voltage drop, but our loss, because we're at a higher voltage, is only 17.3 watts. So our efficiency is 99.14%. And the cost of the cabling is about half of that of what it was for the 12 volt system. All right, so let's jump this up to 3000 watts. Okay, now we're looking at 250 amps. And we are off the chart here. So if I were to wire this up, I'd probably use double 0-aught wire. But with 1 gauge wire, we'd be looking at a voltage drop of 0.3 volts, which would be 77 watts. Efficiency of 97.42. But if we were going to be doubling these, so essentially our loss is going to get cut in half on those. But our cost is going to be double, so we're going to be over $120. Now if we go to 24 volts system, now our current draw is going to be 125 amps. So at 125 amps, we can get away with single gauge wire. Actually, because it's such a short distance, I will use 4 gauge wire, and it still gives us a 98% efficiency, and we're using our cost is going to be about $33 for the wiring. So a little bit of savings there going to 24 volts. So now let's take a look at using a microwave through our inverter. So a typical RV microwave that's say 900 watts will actually consume around 1350 watts. So let's say the distance of it is say 10 feet away, but we need to double that because it has to go through the hot and back through the neutral. So we plug that in and we look at current consumption. It's around 11 amps. So usually with the microwaves, I always run 12 gauge wire, although 14 gauge would handle it. But if we're using the 12 gauge wire, we're going to have efficiency at 99.7% with a cost of $6.80 for the cabling, which is pretty reasonable. The only thing with this efficiency is we also have to factor in the efficiency of the inverter itself, which most of them, when you work off of 24 volts, are well over 90%. So if you take 0.9 times the 99.7, that would be your true efficiency. All right, so now let's take a look at the electrical system we use in our Omnia van builds. So this diagram represents our battery system. Down here we actually have this represents our batteries. So I'm using a 24 volt battery. Different variations we typically install are 100 amp or 200 amp hours. But remember, at 24 volts, that's twice the capacity of a 12 volt. So 100 amps at 24 volts is the same as 12 volts at 200 amp hours. So looking back up to the top, we have a solar charge controller, we have a 3000 watt inverter, we have our AC charger, which typically is a 20 amp charger. Some versions we can install a 40 amp charger. We got our DC to DC converter, which typically we use 40 amp, and this says 12 volts, but I use a 13.8 volt output. This in here, this APU MP. So APU stands for auxiliary power unit. That's what we refer to this whole battery pack unit as. So this is all microprocessor controlled. Now this entire APU is packaged into one unit that can be removed and used as a standalone power source. One of the many advantages of the APU is that the inverter circuitry is in close proximity to the battery cells. This reduces power loss due to high amperage through the cabling. So going back to our diagram, if we follow these red and green lines, this is our DC bus. That's at 24 volts. So the red is positive, green is negative. These little blocks you see in here, these are relays or contactors. The orange lines are coming from our solar panels. So the purpose of these relays is through this microprocessor, it can detect low temperature conditions, so it can enable this heater. So the heater can power off of either the solar cells coming in or after the AC charger. So it doesn't actually consume battery power, it uses our charging sources. And whenever we're at a low temperature, the relays will prevent the battery from charging. One of the things you may notice is that we have a 12 volt output, but not a 12 volt input. You could easily think we don't have a way to recharge our battery from the vehicle alternator. But we have a solution to that, which we prefer over DC to DC chargers. To understand our solution, let's take a look at an electrical overview of our Omnia van. At the heart of our system is the power management system, which is denoted by the gray box. All of the yellow lines are 120 volts coming from the power management system's panel board. They are going to all the outlets and appliances in the van. The orange lines represent power sources coming into the power management system. These include shore power, the APU inverter, and the vehicle inverter. The vehicle inverter is powered from the van's 12 volt battery that resides below the floorboard on the driver's side. The inverter resides under the driver's seat, so it is in close proximity to the battery. It is a 2000 watt pure sine wave inverter and is only switched on when the van's ignition is on and the battery voltage is above 13 volts. The vehicle inverter will then send 120 volts back to the power management system, which will provide power to various devices in the van, including the APU battery charger. The power management system works by using a relay that energizes when the vehicle inverter is powered on, transferring power from shore power to the vehicle inverter. However, in the Omnia, this relay is controlled by a microprocessor. The advantage of using an inverter instead of a DC to DC battery charger is we have less loss over a long cable run, lower initial system cost, and we can easily use an APU or battery system with any battery size such as 12 volts, 24 volts, or even 48 volts. Since the Omnia van uses 120 volt refrigerators as the primary option, it is also powered off the vehicle inverter when the van is running. Otherwise, it will be powered by the APU inverter when not connected to shore power.
So while 12 volt refrigerators are coming down in price and improving in efficiency, they're still more expensive than the 120 volt units of the same size. For these and other reasons such as serviceability under warranty, I still prefer to use 120 volt refrigerators. So with 600 watts of solar and 2500 watt hour battery capacity, I can run an 11 cubic foot 120 volt refrigerator 24/7 without running out of battery capacity. And that's even on mostly cloudy days.
And now here are my thoughts on air conditioning a van.
So the new low voltage air conditioners on the market, whether they be 12 volt or 24 volt, claim to have higher efficiencies than a standard 120 volt rooftop unit. And I have no reason to doubt that. But they still just don't have the cooling capacity of 120 volt units. And some setups, that might be okay. But with the Omnia van having a lot more square footage due to the slide outs, they just won't keep up. In fact, anything less than 15,000 BTUs would probably be insufficient. So the disadvantage I find with using a smaller capacity air conditioner, even in a regular sized van or even a smaller van, is they'll eventually get the temperature down. But if you open the sliding door on a hot day, there goes a lot of your cold air and in comes the hot air, and now you're waiting a long while for it to get cooled back down. The other thing to think about is trying to run the air conditioner off of batteries at night, and that takes a lot of battery capacity, which adds a lot of weight to your van. So then let's say you have enough battery capacity to run your air conditioner through the night. Then what do you do to recharge it the next day? So with 2,500 watt hours of battery capacity and 600 watts of solar, it'll take you about half a day to recharge those batteries. And if you have 5,000 watt hours of batteries, you're looking at a full day to recharge your batteries. Trying to fit more than 600 watts of solar panels on a van is tough to do. And if you're needing more than 5,000 watt hours of batteries, then solar definitely won't keep up. So the other option a lot of people seek out is to install a secondary alternator to do fast charging. So this is an expensive option, plus you've just now added a lot more weight to your van. Plus, using your engine to recharge your batteries is not free like solar panels. You're going to be paying for that in the form of gasoline. Even when you're driving, it's going to reduce your gas mileage, so you're paying for that electricity you're putting back into your batteries. So if you're going to run your van's engine to recharge your batteries to keep your van cool, which is an inefficient process, by the way, why not just run your van's air conditioning system to cool your van in the first place? And in the Omnia, we do just exactly that. And I'll show you how that's done. So I know some of you are probably thinking that the van's AC system doesn't have enough capacity to cool the whole van. And I'm going to tell you that that's not true. The actual issue is getting the cold air circulated to the back. Now, with any camper van being insulated, it won't have any problems cooling it. Now, a cargo van with no insulation, yeah, it couldn't cool the whole thing. So the big thing is to have some good reflectix in the windows. And the other thing is when we're running the AC, we want to have it turned down cold, of course, and we want to put the fan all the way up on high. And especially these two middle vents, we want to make sure they're wide open, and we're aiming them so that they go towards the back of the van. Now that's just the first part of it. The second part is a fan to circulate the air once it gets through the cab and to move that air to the very back of the van. In the Omnia, we accomplish this by running the blower fan on the rooftop AC unit. This circulates the air to the back and into the slide-out bathroom. The fan is powered by the vehicle inverter and is selected in the Pecan app by enabling the V-Inverter Fan Enable mode. We will take the tablet and place it in the rear of the van, and it will alert us if any abnormal conditions occur with the engine. Of course, we also have a high-quality carbon monoxide and smoke detector to help guard us while we sleep. Alright, well, I hope you found this video informative and helpful. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments section below. Thanks for watching.